Play Nirvana.
The Cobain 50.
Nirvana.
Kurt Cobain's top 50 albums.
Nirvana.
From listener-powered KEXP.
This is the Cobain 50 from listener-powered KEXP. I'm Dusty Henry.
And I'm Martin Douglas. And this week, we are doing another bonus episode. We spoke with Michael Azerrad, who wrote the amplified Come As You Are, The Story of Nirvana, which is the Nirvana book,
yes,
as far as I'm concerned. He also wrote the incredible Our Band Could Be Your Life, which I've probably read as many times as my pastor in childhood has read the Holy Bible. And also, a number of bands on Kurt's list are featured in that book as well. We talked to him for about an hour about all of the finer points of the amplified Come As You Are, The Story of Nirvana, where he talks about his friendship with Kurt. He talks about the whirlwind that came with writing this book, with writing a Nirvana biography at the height of Kurt's fame, basically. Yeah. He also talks about the very sad aftermath of Kurt's death.
Michael joined us from his place in New York City, so you'll hear the occasional noises in the background, like cars and dogs. You know, typical New York fare.
Without further ado, here is my and Dusty's interview with Michael Azerrad. Could you describe your feelings initially going into the web of Nirvana?
I got assigned to write a cover story on Nirvana for Rolling Stone in early 1992 as Nirvana mania was exploding. And it was only my second Rolling Stone cover story. At that time, a Rolling Stone cover story was a really big deal for everybody involved, the writer, the subject, the public. And so, I came at it, not nervous, but on edge, especially because so little was known about Kurt. Like, all we knew was that he, screamed and smashed his guitars, was from a little rural town in Washington State, and might be a heroin addict. So I'd never met a heroin addict, and I just didn't know what to expect at all. I was kind of intimidated. And I flew out to Los Angeles. They were living in the Fairfax section of Los Angeles, and knocked on the door of their little apartment in this little building. And this person I'd heard about called Courtney Love answered the door, offered me a plate of grapes very graciously, and said, "Oh, Kurt's just down the hall." And I walked down this short hallway, which seemed to elongate as I walked down it because I was so nervous. I push open the door, and there's Kurt Cobain lying in bed with his back to the wall, and I remember his feet were sticking out the bottom of the blankets, and his toenails were painted pinkish red. And he looks up at me and he says, "Oh, hi." And in that moment, I realized, or I thought anyway, I know this guy. He just seemed so familiar. And he was just like a lot of people I knew in high school, basically. We started the interview, and he mentioned that his parents were divorced or they split up anyway, when he was around 10. And that he was kind of melancholic ever since. And the same thing had happened to me. So I told him that, and we kind of connected from there. And he said he was short for his age. And I stood up and I said, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about." And, I'm 5'6" and kind of wiry. So we had a laugh about that. And it turned out we listened to a lot of the same bands when we were teenagers. We were stoners in high school, just so much in common. But I don't claim to be unique in that respect. I think literally tens of millions of people around Kurt's age could have related to his story one way or another. And that, I think, was his genius, being able to convert that relatability into songs that that had lyrics that were often kind of abstract, and yet you knew exactly what he was saying. And I think, I don't know, that's just part of what made him so great. But anyway, and then that August, I went to the Reading Festival in England that Nirvana was headlining. And I was standing in the lobby where all the bands were staying, and I felt this weird, felt like someone was sort of passing their hand lightly over the top of my head, like not touching it, but like just the hairs on the top of your head, sort of picking it up like whiskers. And I thought someone was kind of goofing on me, so I ignored it. And it just kept going on. And I finally turned around to see who it was, and there was no one near me. But I don't know, maybe 20, 30 feet away was Kurt Cobain staring directly at me. So I walked up to him and said hi, and we kind of renewed our connection that we made during the interview. But the thing is, that Rolling Stone story, I think, was the first time that anyone connected his childhood with his music, the way he grew up with his music. I made a point of saying how much in love he was with Courtney, who was kind of starting to come under fire at that point. And I think and Courtney, I think, appreciated that. And I just put in a lot of stuff that he really wanted people to know. And I think he appreciated that. And then, later that year, I got a call from Courtney asking if I'd like to write a book about Nirvana. And I said, can I talk to Kurt about that? And she said, sure. And she handed the phone to Kurt, and we talked about it. And I said, I don't want this to be authorized, meaning I don't want the subject to have final cut over the manuscript. That's what that means. And Kurt already knew what that meant. And he said, no way, that would be two Guns N' Roses. And that's when I started the book, Come As You Are, The Story of Nirvana. And that was published in June of 93.
It's crazy to think about a time when there wasn't much known about Kurt. I think that's something we talked about starting this podcast, where there's so much has already been said.
Yeah.
What was, I don't know. I guess I'm just kind of curious to think about that, and, how you go about talking to the biggest rock star in the world at that time with zero precedent kind of set.
There's a line in a John Travolta movie. I think it was called Perfect. It was about a Rolling Stone type reporter, and the Travolta character says, when you interview people who aren't famous, treat them as if they are. And when you talk to people who are famous, treat them as if they aren't. And I actually had never seen that movie, and I only learned about that quotation later. But that's exactly what I did. I just kept my cool around Kurt and treated him like a normal person, which wasn't difficult because I kind of related to him a lot. But he really responded to that. He was very uncomfortable when people were uncomfortable around him, which makes a lot of sense. And he was very comfortable when people were comfortable around him. And I think that was the basis of that. It's just treating him like a person, which I think he was not always treated as all too often.
I think the best advice I've ever gotten as far as interviewing artists is when a friend of mine asked me, do you think this person is nervous to talk to you? And then it was like, oh, it unlocked something for me. And I have taken that to heart ever since in every interview I've ever done.
Months later, writing Come As You Are, I actually told Kurt that I was nervous to meet him. But the second I met him, I knew it was going to be okay. And he said, I thought the same thing. I was really nervous to meet you because, like I say, I was the guy from New York, from Rolling Stone, and as much as he said he detested Rolling Stone, he knew what was going on. And yeah, he was nervous too. And somehow I put him at ease.
Can you pinpoint a moment where your relationship with Kurt actually turned into a friendship? Can you point to a moment and say, oh, that's when we became friends?
It was after the book was done. I would start to get these calls really late at night. And bear in mind, I was in New York and Kurt was in Seattle. So there was a 3-hour difference. And he would call, he was a nocturnal person. So he would call like, maybe midnight his time. And it was, like 3 a.m. my time. And, when the phone rings at 3 a.m, you tend to answer it. What could that be? And there was no, this in 1993 or whatever it was, there was no caller ID. So I just picked up the phone. And after a while, I learned, that's obviously Kurt. But he would just call to just unload. He would just vent about business stuff mostly. And I would listen and listen and listen. And then at one time this happened, and he stopped and he said, oh God, I'm just talking about myself so much. How are you? And I told him, and he listened. And that's when it, kind of shifted from, me kind of, interviewing him or being listening to him, and my actually, saying stuff that he listened to. And I'm not saying, we were close buds or anything like that, but, he would call me every now and then and vent.
I do imagine there's still a lot of like, you're doing the first book about Nirvana at that time. And, I imagine myself, like, remember being a young reporter, I'm like, wow, I really want to do a good job. I want them to like it. Like, how do you, maybe we're more evolved than I was at that point, but how did you kind of handle that pressure?
Oh, no, I took Kurt at his word. He said, just tell the truth. And I proceeded on the assumption that if I just tell the truth, that would work out for everybody, for me, for the band, for the reader. And that's, that is what you try to do as a journalist. And so that's what I did. And sure enough, there's a whole scene in The Amplified Come As You Are where I talk about watching Kurt read the book shortly before it was published as a courtesy, because my agent thought that he should be able to read the book before the press did, because there were so many, bombshells in it. But what everybody was forgetting was that Kurt himself said virtually all the bombshells. So when Kurt read the book, he wasn't surprised by pretty much anything at all. People ask me, wow, wasn't that awkward to watch someone, read your book about them? And, no, I was totally confident that I'd gotten the story as right as I could get it, in the space of whatever it was, like 6 or 7 months I wrote that book in. It's insane. So I was confident, and, I wasn't uneasy about watching Kurt read it, because I knew it was the best I could do. Maybe we should explain what The Amplified Come As You Are is. I annotated the original book, which means I inserted notes in between the paragraphs of the original book. Maybe there's all kinds of notes about Kurt's compositional method, things about indie rock culture, political culture, musical culture, like the Slackers, Gen X and all that stuff that was just starting to hit the media radar screen at the time. All kinds of cultural references that after reading it again for the first time in like 30 years, I noticed that some things were really worth exploring and explaining, not just for the audience who, was with Nirvana the first time, but all the people who got into Nirvana even after Nirvana broke up. And also it was a kind of a healing thing for myself, just to try to make sense of what happened. Because that whole experience was a really life-changing one for me, and it ended just so horribly. And I'd just been trying to make sense of it ever since. And I think a lot of other people have been trying to make sense of it as well. So, this book is for them and me.
When you were reading through the original text, was that after you had decided to write an annotated version of the book, or was it before? Was that what led to the idea?
I had always wanted to say something about this little bit in the book about Kurt sleeping under the bridge in Aberdeen. when he was kicked out of his house. And, that's, some people say, no, it never happened. And then some people say it might have happened. And I wanted to write something about that, and just thinking about how it's kind of pondering the nature of journalism, frankly, about how you kind of depend on your subject's truthfulness, especially if you can't verify something with a second source, and how the journalist and the subject use each other. The journalist wants to get a good story, get some juicy stuff out of the subject, and the subject wants to manipulate their story to their advantage. And so it's this kind of wrestling match. So I wanted to write just a blog post about that, just to get it off my chest, because it had been bothering me for so many years that maybe I'd been, hornswoggled by Kurt on that one. It was just some good old fashioned rock and roll myth making. Mm-hmm. And so I just figured, I'll just post it in a blog, and on my blog, it's called You and What Army, and just, tweet out the link and be done with it. But then I thought, well, let's see, let's go back to the beginning of the book, see if there's anything else I want to say. And by the way, this is during the pandemic, when everything was really quiet, except for constant ambulance sirens outside my window. And sure enough, like on page 1, there was something that I thought, oh boy, I got something to say about this. So I wrote that too. And then went to the next page. Oh yeah. I got something good about this. One thing led to another. And a couple of years later, I'd gone through the whole book just for the hell of it, and to stay busy during the deepest, darkest depths of the pandemic, when, like I say, I was trying to drown out the sounds of the ambulances racing by near me. And I casually mentioned it to my literary agent that I'd done this thing. And he said, you could probably publish this. And I honestly had not thought about it. I just did it to pass the time, basically. Once I got that idea in my head, I went back and revised it and took it even more seriously. And eventually a publisher called Harper One, which is a division of HarperCollins, signed the book. And here we are. The Amplified Come As You Are.
That's awesome. It's such a fascinating read to go through, and it really fun, because it feels like almost like you're having a conversation with yourself across, 30 years.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is.
Was there anything like therapeutic about going through that process of like revisiting your, not just Nirvana, but kind of your past self at the same time?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I many times in the book, I mention how just green and naive I was. And I'm, 30 years later, I'm very comfortable with pointing that out, and even, saying it in public. And that was very therapeutic. And it is very much a dialogue between myself today and my 1993 self. And that was therapeutic. And like I say, it just kind of helped me sort out a pretty huge time in my life, personally and professionally. And so, it was therapeutic. And it was just, like it's a dialogue between my old self and my current self, which is a lot like what another writer named Robert Greenfield did with a book he wrote about the Rolling Stones called Ain't It Time We Say Goodbye. He took a similar approach, this kind of dialogue approach between what he knows now and what he didn't know then. I recommend that book too. I also think as you read the book, I was struck by, I think I've improved a lot as a writer in the intervening time too. I would hope I had, but it is, I think the difference in tone and style is, I think, a story in itself.
When you talk about being really green and naive, I'm wondering, what was the process from a critical perspective of revisiting your old work? Were you kind of mortified? Were you proud of where you were back then, even though you acknowledge that you've improved?
Oh, well, like I say, I think I did the best I could at that time, and that's all you can ask for. And like I say, also that, with the passage of time, you can have some objectivity about your own self. And I was inspired to feel that way from writing another book I wrote called Our Band Could Be Your Life, about the American indie rock underground in the 80s. So when I was interviewing people for that, they were telling all kinds of really unflattering stories about themselves. And it was because so much time had passed that they could look back on themselves and objectively, and they'd done a lot of growing up and maturing and gathered a lot of wisdom, and they could look back on themselves dispassionately. And I really took a cue from that. I thought, wow, that's really wonderful that they're able to do that. And I took that to heart, and I applied that to writing The Amplified Come As You Are. And it's about as candid as I think I can get. And it's certainly, it's really the only time I've ever written in the first person, professionally, except for a piece I did for Spin, some years back about a band called an English band called Tube Lord did a song called I Am Azerrad. So I wrote a necessarily first person piece about that. And if you want to search for that, the title of it was Lyrical Assassin. So this is the first time I've really written in first person, and it was, it was difficult, but also easy. I could do it.
One thing you've mentioned here already is you talk about these bands reflecting themselves in the past. You talk about Kurt as kind of like a myth maker, creating these sort of narratives for himself, which is not unprecedented either. You think of like Bob Dylan or any other artist who kind of told these stories about themselves.
Going back to Robert Johnson even.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like there's always just the mythology that they're creating. And clearly Kurt was a student of like rock and roll history. How did you navigate that? You talk about this a bit in the book, but how did you navigate like when something felt like, I don't know, like, did you really sleep under a bridge, for example, or these types of tall tales?
Well, sometimes I bought it, because he said it absolutely sincerely, and there was no way to, verify it or, contradict it. Otherwise, if something didn't ring true, I probably just left it out, So there's a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor that, no one ever saw. To the best of my recollection, that's how that worked. But like I say, some of it I bought. I think that's one of the more interesting things about The Amplified Come As You Are, is I kind of point out every now and then, where Kurt is stretching the truth or even outright lying. And I hope it kind of reminds people that journalists are not infallible. To quote Chris Novoselic at the 1992 Video Music Awards, who was in turn quoting Joseph Goebbels, don't believe everything you read, or at least think critically about it. A lot of these annotations are about critically thinking about something that I myself wrote. But I hope that it prompts people who read the book to think that way about anything they read. Because journalists are human beings, and they're not, just a machine. They're people who walk into certain physical or emotional or social environments that have an effect on them. And I think I write about that a fair amount in the amplified version.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I want to emblazon that on a billboard, that we are not machines. We are not content farms or whatever, that we are people too. So yes, thank you for acknowledging that.
Anytime you call me up, I'll remind you.
So one thing that I was thinking about while you were explaining the tendency for Kurt to kind of make his own myth is that you point out several instances in the book where Kurt is kind of creating a villain or creating an adversary for himself. And I was wondering, is that something that you had already been cognizant of when you were writing the original text, or did it come through in your writing for the Amplified Come As You Are?
Well, see, the thing is, like, I wrote the original Come As You Are, and like I say, in 6 or 7 months, the band still existed. And I was just writing really quickly. And I was just, writing out the story pretty much as it came in, and shaping it into a narrative form. Things were moving so fast, and I was right in the thick of it, that that kind of pattern is something that you only notice, when you can step back. And I couldn't step back. Like I say, everything was moving fast, and I was right in the thick of this intense story. So no, that's something I only noticed when I read the book 30 years later. I had the objectivity to look at it that way. And there are just certain motifs in Come As You Are that I point out in the amplified version. The original book was kind of a rich text. There was so much stuff in it that really merited illumination, and the kind of illumination, like I say, that you can only kind of come up with when you have a lot of distance on it. So yeah, I noticed Kurt would always often bring up an antagonist, someone who was something in the way of his progression or success. And there's I don't know, maybe 9 or 10 of them in the book. I pointed out each time, and it was just a tendency of his. Another thing I noticed, another theme I noticed was shame. Shame comes up a lot in Kurt's discourse and his songs. Again, something I didn't see at the time, but looking back through the book, wow, oh yeah. I noticed a lot of his working method involved collage. Again, something I really had to step back to notice, and I point that out too. He collaged lyrics, he even collaged chords. A lot of times he used chords in his songs that didn't properly belong in the key of the song. He collaged video, he collaged artwork, he collaged sculptures. That was a really big working method for him, and that ties into a whole long artistic lineage that includes one of his heroes, William S. Burroughs. So I have a whole, riff about that. There was just so much in the book that lent itself to that kind of observation and elaboration and expansion. I think I found a lot of really cool stuff.
You mentioned how Kurt left Aberdeen and went to Olympia, where there are more college kids, more erudite, sort of sophisticated, artists and punks. And being as though I have a particular interest in Olympia, I was wondering if you had any opinions on what Kurt referred to as the Calvinists, or the people, the followers of Calvin Johnson and the whole K Records culture that was cultivated in Olympia.
I mean, that was a really huge influence on Kurt, as was, I think, concurrently, the Riot Girl movement. It awakened him to whole new, vistas of music. It informed him about maybe punk rock as an ethos rather than just a sound. It turned him on to different kinds of art, different kinds of people. There were people from all over the country at Evergreen. And, the K Records aesthetic was playing music even though you might not have chops. It's just, whether you have spirit and ideas and, energy. And that was a really big breakthrough, I think, for Kurt. After that, he prized those things a lot more than just speedy, chops or, hard rockin'. And that's, you read through that 50 albums list and you can see that concept borne out, that as he became more sophisticated in his tastes and just grew up a little, he kind of left behind the more technical music and got into stuff that was more, like I say, kind of soulful and inspired. A good example of that being his love of Leadbelly.
Yeah.
Who was a great player, but, fairly simple music. Or, his love of any of the rough trade bands and like Marine Girls and Vaselines and things like that. There was a really big time for Kurt. And of course, he got turned on to feminism and learning about how nasty things like racism and homophobia are and sexism. That was a pivotal, huge time for him.
Maybe I'm getting into hot take territory, and this is not meant to disrespect anybody, but I was, as much as Nirvana's considered maybe like the quintessential grunge band, they were kind of the least, maybe it's outside of Bleach, kind of least grungy grunge band to me. Like once they hit Nevermind, I felt like I feel a lot more of these other influences like the Beatles or, Beat Happening and stuff starting to come into play. I guess I'm curious of your thoughts on that and like the grunge label with them.
Yeah, well, I mean, all the best bands, evolve. I don't know. Look at how Talking Heads started out and how where they wound up. Starting with Talking Heads 77, going through like something like Remain in Light. That's what you do as an artist. You try to evolve and trust that your audience will follow. And if they don't, oh well. I mean, there's a whole lot in the Amplified Come As You Are about Kurt making the potentially fatal mistake of tailoring his music to what he thought either the audience or the label wanted. Like before they signed to Sub Pop, Nirvana was making kind of like gnarly, music, sort of kind of complicated stuff. And then when Nirvana signed to Sub Pop, Kurt realized that he's got to simplify it and make it sound more like some of the classic rock that all the other bands on Sub Pop were rooted in. And so he did, he stripped down Nirvana's sound for Bleach. And then, I don't know, he evolved again. I can't say that he, tailored his sound for a major label audience for Nevermind, but he was evolving, and I think he just felt free or even maybe compelled to evolve with his music and maybe make things that were even more simple and yet even more melodic. And I think he made a kind of almost a retrograde move on In Utero, kind of very self-consciously getting back to roots. And I think once he'd gotten that out of his system, who knows what he would have done next. Yeah. But that's a parlor game to guess about that.
Yeah, exactly. Going back to Sub Pop, there was a very specific way that Sub Pop marketed those for lack of a better term, the grunge bands of that era. And they kind of marketed bands like Nirvana and Tad and the ones from farther afield from Seattle as sort of redneck savants when Kurt was actively trying to move away from the perception of being a redneck. Or you have Tad Doyle was, he studied music at the University of Idaho. And I was wondering how you felt about Sub Pop kind of marketing Nirvana and some of their peers as redneck savants.
I have to say, at the time, like everyone else, I was totally, enamored of it. I thought, like, this is brilliant. It was great marketing. I bought into it. A lot of people did. I can't say I was like that savvy to say like, whoa, wait a minute. Tad Doyle was a music major and he's a very well-spoken guy. What's he doing with a chainsaw? He's probably never picked up a chainsaw in his life. I didn't think about it. I just thought like, wow, that looks totally badass, And it worked. It only started to dawn on me when I talked to Kurt about it. As I said earlier, like, this is a guy who's trying to leave Aberdeen behind. That's what he was trying to do. He met with, he met Chris Novoselic, a sophisticated guy who was like bilingual, had traveled around Europe, came from Los Angeles, listened to really cool music. And Kurt hung out with Buzz Osborne, really sharp, super smart guy who found out about all kinds of music before anyone else. And then he goes to Olympia and he's with all these sophisticated college kids. And later on, he hangs out with, makes friends with Danny Goldberg, a very urbane, cosmopolitan, intelligent man who owned Gold Mountain, Nirvana's management company, and Courtney, a very cultured person. Anyway, so he was trying to leave that behind, and then he hits Sub Pop, and they make him out to be, as he put it, this stump-dumb rocker dude from Aberdeen. And he told me that felt degrading because, as he said, that was something I was fighting against all my life. And I'll never forget this. And this is the kind of thing that I put in the notes, because I didn't put this in the book, but I put it in the Amplified Come As You Are. But Kurt was, his voice was breaking when he said that last line. He was almost going to cry. He was so upset about it because, like I say, he was trying so hard to leave that part of himself behind and grow as a person and as an artist. And then he just gets thrown back to being a stump-dumb rocker dude from Aberdeen. And I felt his pain and I got it. On the other hand, what Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman at Sub Pop did, it was brilliant marketing and it really, really worked. And I think Kurt and probably a lot of the other bands did go on to live down that, the stump-dumb rocker dude from the provinces thing and become artists who are highly regarded in their own right. So, maybe that whole approach of Sub Pop was they had to do it to get noticed, especially in that time. Again, remember, this is late 88, 87, 88. And we're just coming off this kind of day-glow, geometric haircut, synth pop era of MTV. And I think Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman were very astute students of popular culture, and they knew that eventually people were going to get tired of that and want the exact opposite. So it went from people having really high poofy hair to people having really flat, greasy hair, for instance, or day glow colors to earth tones, and geometric kind of clothing to flannel plaid. And that was very astute of them. And it was painful for some of their artists. But like I say, I think it worked out in the end.
For sure. I mean, I know the thing I really appreciate about going through your book is how much you speak to Kurt's sensitivity, but then also reading it with the perspective, everything that happened after. This what struck me is that how young Kurt was and how fast everything happened.
Yeah.
Like he's in Ocean Shores working at a hotel, and spraying shaving cream over Barbie dolls. A couple years later, he's like the biggest artist in the world. I imagine that's just the mind fuck of it all has got to be huge.
Yeah.
Especially for someone who was never expected to amount to much. And the guy was a high school dropout, He didn't come from, certainly didn't come from money or, he was probably middle class at best, at very best. And, he's a working class guy. And he just was not prepared for that kind of success. And today's indie rockers, a lot of them come from some serious privilege, and they can handle the fame and all the business that goes with it. But Kurt just was not prepared for that at all. I think he eventually got some good people around him, but it was still overwhelming, I think, for all involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I feel like this is a good time to go over some of the albums that were on Kurt's list. But before we start talking about the specific albums that were listed, I wanted to ask you if you remember any specific discussion with Kurt about, music in general. Like what artists were the two of you talking about?
Wow. He didn't talk a lot about the Beatles, but he mentioned them, dropped their name a lot. Black Sabbath, he mentioned quite a bit in terms of like classic rock. Yeah, that's a good question. I think those are the two bands that really jumped to mind. I don't know. We didn't talk a whole lot about his roots. He did tell me this really sweet story about how he would listen to a Queen album called News of the World in his dad's van while his dad was at work. And he listened to it over and over, so much so that he would often run down the battery. And it's really interesting that he was into Queen on a musical level and a kind of professional level. Musically, Queen, they served up the riffs.
Yeah.
For all that kind of pompous stuff, those are some meaty riffs. And I'm sure that made a big impression on Kurt. But also, a lot of the bands that he was into early on, like the Beatles, Cheap Trick, Led Zeppelin, the Cars, whatever, were bands that, and Queen, really embraced fame, or at least seemed to. They seemed to revel in fame. It was like, yeah, this is part of the deal that we were shooting for. Mm-hmm. We want to be rock stars. And that was Kurt's original conception of being a musician. His first favorite band was the Beatles, the biggest band ever.
Yeah.
That was his original conception. And then he comes to Olympia, where there's a label called Kill Rock Stars. Mm-hmm. And the idea was not to be a star.
Yeah, going back to the Calvinists.
Yeah. And so, there's, one of the great animating, conflicts of his artistic and I'm sure personal life right there. It's funny though, that list, I don't know if I was the first person to ask about this, but I did ask him for Come As You Are to do a list of 50 key albums. And I would put it in the appendix. I thought that would be really cool for people to know. And he faxed me off a list. It was pretty close to the one that you guys are working on. I thought, okay, great, I'll use that. And then a few days later, I get this answering machine message from Kurt, and he said, please do not print that top 50 records list. And he said there was too many bands I left off, and he pissed people off by not including them. He said it's caused a lot of problems in my household. And I remember he said this. He said, it's ridiculous. So I didn't print it. And later on, I asked him, what was that all about? And he said that Courtney had called him out on not mentioning the bands that he grew up on, like Cheap Trick and Led Zeppelin, mm-hmm. and Black Sabbath and Queen and the Cars, AC/DC. I think Creedence Clearwater Revival's not on the list either. These are all like really formative bands for Kurt, but he didn't put them on the list because they were not cool.
Yeah.
And Courtney called him on it. I think, fair enough, So I think a true 50 albums list would have certainly included those bands as well.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite anecdotes on the book, by the way, because I wouldn't want people to know that I listened to Hootie and the Blowfish as a kid,
And now we all know.
And now the world knows.
Well, at least you busted yourself.
Yes.
But, he also leaves out things, bands like the Ramones or Husker Du. You would think, I don't know, or Minor Threat. I don't know. You would think, I think the Meat Puppets are not on that list. Pretty, I don't know. No list is perfect, but it's interesting, what he left out, as well as what he put in.
Yeah, I feel like people like us, like who listen to a lot of music, and music is very important to us. It's as important to us as breathing air. Like 50 is a really short list.
Yeah.
You're leaving a lot of stuff when you only include 50 artists.
Let alone 3 Wipers albums.
Well, I think those lists, lists like that are perhaps more the myth making that we were talking about earlier on Kurt's part.
Oh, yeah.
And by the way, if you look in his journals, he puts in a quote, new, improved, revised list that includes stuff like Rumors by Fleetwood Mac, Breakfast in America, Supertramp, The Buggles. I love that record. He might have been kidding about REO Speedwagon, but he did put that in the list. But I think that new list, or the addendum anyway, was, I think, inspired by that exchange that I was just talking about.
That is a really interesting idea, because I think, every once in a while this list will start circulating again online, like on social media or different websites. And the general takeaway I see, and personally have felt too, is like, this is probably the coolest list I've ever seen. Like, it's
right.
And it's interesting to think that was like intentional. Like, you could assume that, but like, just to hear like if you're trying to make the coolest list possible, like, mission accomplished.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to seem like the coolest guy possible.
As we continued talking with Michael Azerrad, we decided to ask him about some of the albums on Kurt's list that we've already covered so far in the series. Here he is talking about the Sex Pistols. Never mind the bollocks. Here's the Sex Pistols.
For a guy who loved punk rock, I mean, that's the canonical, punk rock album for starters. But again, it's pretty like chunky, riffy music that's really catchy. Got a huge, like sing-along thing to it, with this great heaving swing that Nirvana could also get. I think a vocal approach that Kurt really did a lot was to kind of put a distortion, a fuzz box on his voice, rather than singing in his pure voice. He would kind of rasp it out. And Johnny Rotten did that really well. I think Kurt was listening to that. But also, never mind the bollocks. It's like I say, it's a classic punk record. It's a definitive punk record, but it was also highly produced and yet very raw and very powerful. Kind of like another album called Nevermind. Nevermind the Bollocks has just stacks and stacks of guitars, and the meticulously recorded and stacked guitars. And the drum sounds are also really highly wrought, and it's kind of like Nevermind. It's raw, but it's also extremely well recorded. Well, not just well recorded, but it took a lot of production to get those sounds. So I think that maybe that's what Kurt was picking up on, partly the idea that you could make a highly produced and yet extremely raw and powerful punk rock album.
So, next on our list of albums we want to talk about, the classic trio of albums by the Wipers, Is This Real, Youth of America, Over the Edge. You have any opinions about those records?
In my humble opinion, those are goddamn great records. All 3 of those really great records. And I still, to this day, overlooked anywhere but the Northwest. Wipers and I would say Dead Moon were 2 really influential Portland bands, total DIYers, DIY bands who had a huge impact and were a great inspiration for bands all over the Northwest and particularly throughout the 80s. But they never really made that much of an impact in the rest of the country, which is really unfortunate. But boy, those records are fantastic. Wipers, it's a lot of angst and alienation that I think Kurt surely related to. But again, super catchy punk rock. Mm-hmm. I try to avoid, comparing bands to other bands generally, but if I had to shorthand it, I would say Ramones meets Television.
Ooh, I love that.
In the most awesome way. There's a really distinctive harmonic sense that the Wipers have. Greg Sage, the main guy's chords are just super distinctive. But like more than like technical stuff like that, there's just something ineffable about the Wipers' music. There, you just get these feelings that you can't even explain, that aren't maybe objectively in the music, but it makes you feel stuff that you can't even. It's powerful, but you can't explain what it is. They're just a great band.
Yeah.
Greg Sage, another left-handed guitarist, by the way.
Yep. True. Very true.
And then, Kurt, as they say, returned the favor by covering a couple of Wiper songs. They did Return of the Rat and D7. Mm-hmm. I think one of them was on a Wipers tribute album, and there was another one on this Australia-only EP called Hormoning.
Yeah.
Absolutely great band. I so recommend all three of those records, plus the Alien Boy 3-song EP, which is I think their first record. Also,
oh yeah,
totally great. Just like a distinctive, evocative sound, really catchy, but shrouded in a deep, deep atmosphere.
Definitely. I mean, keeping going on the Northwest classics, Mudhoney, Superfuzz, Big Muff, obviously a peer to Nirvana in many ways.
I think the influence of Mudhoney, is huge. Kurt really looked up to them. Mudhoney were real tastemakers, very outspoken and very about their opinions, and with a very specific aesthetic that they put into both, the music that they championed and the music they made. And they were just the coolest of the cool. And Kurt, as great of an artist as he was, also, I think, really craved the approval of people like that, the Seattle tastemakers. And I think Kurt really felt fulfilled once people like Mudhoney acknowledged them as artists. And Superfuzz Big Muff was, that was the shot heard around the world. I guess, after Touch Me, I'm Sick, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about Dan Peters, I have a friend who cites Dan Peters as the best drummer of all time. And how do you compare Dan Peters to Dave Grohl?
Right.
Well, it's like, it's like all-star teams in baseball. Like if you have all the best players on one team, that doesn't necessarily make a good team.
Right.
And like a good team has a certain chemistry that kind of transcends any individual person. And Dan Peters is a wicked good drummer. Keith Moon was a wicked good drummer, but he wouldn't have been a good fit with Nirvana either.
Right.
They, got to have the right fit. Dave Grohl, I think it was just kind of miraculous that he joined Nirvana. Obviously, as I point out in the book and others have pointed out, Kurt and Chris had their eye on him for quite a while, or some few months at least, before he actually joined the band. But it's still kind of miraculous that it all worked out that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Staying in with the Northwest, one more Northwest album, one of my favorite bands of all time, Beat Happening with Jamboree. What are your thoughts on that one?
Well, I love that record. Again, that was a really big eye opener, I think, for Kurt, where you didn't have to make very technical music or even very loud or aggressive music to be good. You just needed to be inspired, creative, and, to use a favorite term of Kurt's, passionate. And that's, Beat Happening was all those things. They played wonderful songs in a super charming way with but it wasn't cutesy. There was definitely a dark, often sexual undertow to that music. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think really, put them over the top, into being something like truly interesting and, possibly timeless.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that Kurt directly emulated Beat Happening, but I think it informed his aesthetic in general. And I think just broadened him aesthetically, not just musically, but just overall aesthetically. Again, like Beat Happening kind of reclaiming what punk rock is. Punk rock isn't, whatever Green Day does. It's an attitude. Part of it is like anyone can do it if they're inspired. You can do an end run around all the corporate filters that keep people from listening to more organic music, and just, and do it yourself. And that's what Beat Happening did, not just with their music, but the way that they released it and recorded it.
Absolutely. And the community they cultivated around it, for sure.
Yeah, that's also a great point. That band wasn't an island. They were part of a really big extended community with a very sophisticated aesthetic and, really, like I say, a great sense of community. And there were all kinds of bands in that community, and they all supported each other and inspired each other. That must have been a really, really exciting time and place to be, Olympia in the mid to late 80s.
Yeah.
I can remember you kind of mentioned the, Be Having Urban said this, like, you don't have to be the most technical proficient or record the best studios and things. Like, I can remember getting into arguments with friends who would be like, Nirvana's not good because look, he's just playing power chords or like whatever. And just be like, no, but like the songs. And it was always this kind of ongoing like technicality versus like emotion. Yeah. That I feel like Be Happening is like the ultimate synthesis of that.
Yep.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Similar spirit in a different way. Black Flag, with 2 albums on the list, My War and Damaged. Obviously, we know you spend a lot of time thinking and writing about this band as well.
Yeah. Well, the thing about My War was the second side was slow. That was really radical. Up until then, everyone was trying to be, play faster than the last record or the last band. Black Flag, in true confrontational punk, form, played slow and just messed with people's heads. And not only that, they did something equally heretical, which is they grew their hair. And gosh, there's a quote from the guitarist from Mudhoney,
Steve Turner.
Yeah, Steve Turner. Thank you. There's a quote from him in Come As You Are, and he talks about how Black Flag came up to Seattle on that tour, and everyone was just blown away by the fact they were playing slow, and they had long hair, and other parts of the country just couldn't cope with it. But the kids in Seattle had grown up on slow, heavy bands with long hair, and then discovered punk rock. So they were kind of excited by this. They were stoked about it. And that's how you get, Mudhoney and partly grunge. You also get that from, I think Flipper was a huge influence on playing slow.
Yeah. The Melvins.
Well, yeah. Well, the Melvins, I think, got the idea maybe from Black Flag.
Yeah.
And some other bands. Maybe Swans also. Yeah. Black Flag was a huge influence, say, on Nirvana, just in that kind of slow, aggressive, heavy way, and that the way they expressed, profound rage and alienation, something that I think Kurt in particular was feeling pretty hard at the time he discovered Black Flag. Yeah, they resonated pretty hard. And, Damaged also just, that whole record is kind of about, feeling so alienated that you must be insane. And a lot of early Black Flag is kind of about that. And again, Kurt talks about that identical feeling. And so I think he really connected with that music, but he also connected with the idea that it was cathartic. Damage is super cathartic. And that's, I think, a lot of what Nirvana was about. I mean, the very name of the band is, means a transcending worldly pain. Yeah. And basically, and I think that's my thesis, is that was the idea of Nirvana, to make music that could transcend pain, help you transcend pain, especially Kurt in particular. I think that's why he would throw himself into the amps and the drums at the end of a lot of shows, to prove that he was impervious, that the music had made him impervious to pain.
Really appreciate you talking this, Michael. And the question we had was, how do you feel about your legacy and Kurt's legacies being intertwined through this book?
Wow. Wow, that's a really big question. I have to really think about that. It's I'm just I'm just a reporter. I just happened to be extremely lucky to get that assignment to write that book, and that's how I feel. I just feel very lucky. That feeling is definitely complicated by what eventually happened, which was really traumatic for me, and I get into that. That's definitely the most personal writing I've ever done, is in that part of the Amplified Come As You Are.
Yeah.
And sometimes, I wish that I hadn't been involved. And mostly today, I think I can have some perspective on it, and I can say that I'm very grateful that I was granted the opportunity to write Come As You Are. I hope I, communicate that and the Amplified Come As You Are. And that was one of the big ideas behind the book, was to shed some light on that experience, not just shedding light on the band, but, again, showing that a human being actually was part of that story, for better or worse. It was, to put it lightly, it was a very intense experience, and it's, it's complicated, as the kids say.
Yeah.
But overall, yeah, I'm very proud. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done this new book. I wouldn't have had the nerve to revisit it. And I hope people get even a tenth as much out of it as I did.
Yeah, it's very much a piece of memoir as it is a biography, and it's really emotional. So thank you for writing the original book and then annotating it, because learning about your story and your experience in the whirlwind of Nirvana mania was fascinating.
Oh, I'm really glad that you think that. I was kind of in the middle of it, so I couldn't even really appreciate it. I was just trying to keep my head above water and do my job and also, live my life. There was also just like my life. That's the story, I think, behind that. I think people have to realize that's behind virtually any book, even fiction. Like I say, there's a human being behind it. And even the experience of writing the book can be really intense. And most of it will probably not wind up on the page, except if they do an annotated version 30 years later.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Michael. We really appreciate it. The book is phenomenal. And thank you for writing both versions of it and talking with us today. It's been so amazing.
Yeah, it's been a real honor to be able to talk to you. You've been, one of my favorite music journalists of probably my lifetime, to be honest. So it was a real honor to get to talk to you today.
Oh, thank you both. That's really, really, really kind. I'm totally unaware of any impact that I may have had. I'm just cranking out the words, and it's always such a pleasant surprise to hear people come back to me and tell me that something I did, inspired them or made them think about things differently. It's really a great honor. I'm really grateful that you told me that. Thanks.
That was our conversation with Michael Azerrad, author of The Amplified Come As You Are, The Story of Nirvana, among a bunch of other different books. That's it for us this week. I'm Martin Douglas.
And I'm Dusty Henry. This has been the Cobain 50 from listener-powered KEXP, where the music matters. Michael joined us from his place in New York City, so you'll hear some occasional... There goes my dog.